All right, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Key Aspects of Project Management for Treasury Management Systems Selection and Implementation. We do ask that anyone who has dialed in, please mute your microphone in order to eliminate any background noise during the presentation. This webinar will consist of a 55-minute presentation followed by a 5-minute question and answer session. Please feel free to post questions in the chat box throughout the webinar, and we will either answer them as you ask or in the Q&A session. If we do not get to your question, someone from our team will follow up with you. Today's webinar is eligible for CTP and FP&A recertification credits. The credit form, a copy of the deck, and the recording will all be sent via email in the next 7 business days. Today's presentation will be given by Ann Geary and Debbie Dennison of Strategic Treasurer. Ann Geary is an executive project manager at Strategic Treasurer. Her industry experience includes chemical, power supply, automotive, retail, health services, and education. Ms. Geary brings a wealth of knowledge to clients based upon over 2 decades of experience supporting corporate treasury and a variety of financial systems technology. She has held senior project management positions with global, multinational, and Fortune 500 corporations. Her leadership experience comprises leveraging technology to proactively identify and implement leading practices with financial systems. Debbie Dennison is a senior consultant at Strategic Treasurer. Mrs. Dennison has held senior treasury positions, global, multinational, and Fortune 500 corporations in the fields of utility, airline, consumer products, and pharmaceuticals. Her leadership experience comprises leveraging technology to proactively identify and implement leading practices with respect to global liquidity, pooling structures, credit card programs, and accounts receivable factoring. Welcome, Ann and Debbie. I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Meredith, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today's session, we're going to walk through the key areas where a mature project management approach will provide the most value for Treasury as you're seeking access to the most efficient solutions in the shortest amount of time and with a minimal cost model throughout the project phases and for ongoing maintenance of the TMS. As we go through today's presentation, we'll cover areas around Treasury's position. We'll do an introduction to TMS project management. We'll dive into some detail around the key elements of project management, talk through considerations that are unique for Treasury, and then we'll go through some key takeaways. I'd also like to make a quick comment that there are many concepts in here that are have originated from the Project Management Institute, and they specifically have excellent resource in their project management body of knowledge. I encourage you all to, as you want to learn more about project management, to seek Project Management Institute as a resource for some great information. So as we are going through the first elements of Treasury's position, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie so she can cover the financial assets and responsibilities of Treasury.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you. Welcome to joining us today for our webinar. Excited to see the number of participants and the coverage across the globe that we have in terms of participants. As we talk about Treasury and Treasury at the helm of a TMS project, the left side of this slide sort of demonstrates many of the different areas that Treasury has influence in or around in terms of the selection and implementation of technology, traditionally around liquidity and cash management. We're responsible for investment management, payments. We have compliance concerns, controls, and securities. These are all responsibilities and different hats that we as Treasury professionals wear. And because we have this influence over such a wide breadth of the organization, we refer at Strategic Treasurer to Treasury being the stewards of financial assets. So though we may not own all of the different areas that are impacted or listed to the left or specifically related to working capital aspects, we are the global corporate steward for those initiatives, actions, plans. And when we have that stewardship, we need to be able to collaborate across the organization. The right side of this slide is a demonstration of the various areas across your organization that you may have to take consideration into when you're looking at a project, working capital management, all the different areas that Treasury is responsible for, and incorporating their needs as well as the Treasury and the overall corporate goals into consideration. So as we approach project management, we want to think about Treasury not necessarily owning all of the aspects of it, but being the steward or the leader across the organization on behalf of Treasury to represent the best needs for all of the touch points that Treasury has with the entire organization. Based on this, I would like to sort of take a polling look. So if we could introduce our first polling question, I'd like to get a feel from the audience to get an understanding of if you have undergone the planning with a TMS implementation within your company. So if you could just take a minute to quickly answer the question for us here. Have you completed or are you planning to undergo a TMS implementation? And we can see the results coming up. And so we've got a nice healthy mix here coming up, which is nice. I think it's a great audience for this particular topic, and that we've got 37%, 38% that's never been involved in a TMS implementation. So I think we'll be able to give you some guidance here around project management, the need for a project manager. And then we have about 41% that has completed a TMS implementation. So I think this is great. We'll have those that have some experience, those that do not have experience, and we'll be able to draw on the benefits of those that have participated in the past and maybe learning from your experience as well as ours and helping the new ones that are coming up in the organizations to starting to implement these systems, how to overcome some of the hurdles they may be facing in their project management challenges. And any thoughts or comments on this polling slide before we move on?
I think what we're seeing from the poll, though, does demonstrate some consistency in what we have found, even just as recently as 2017 when we did a joint strategic treasurer and Treasury Express technology use survey. You could see on the left there that we had at that time last year about 34% that were not using a Treasury system, and then we had the majority there, the rest of 64% that had either a SaaS or an installed system. But I think this shows then that we have a lot of opportunity out there for work that's going to be coming down the road. There's an expectation that some type of systems will have to be implemented in the future. And then what we wanted to show too on the right here is the fact that about only 40% of those that had a TMS, that they were only about 40% were using 80 to 100% of the functionality that was purchased. So I think what we want to take from these two graphs is that while there's going to be a significant number of implementations coming up, we want to make sure that we have the right information to properly manage those implementations so that we can get that percentage up on the right there of the number of folks that have gone through an implementation and are getting the most functionality for the dollars spent during that time, especially depending on the scope of your implementation. It's very costly. It takes a lot of time to go through this process, and you want to make sure that you are investing wisely and that you have the highest return possible from the use of your TMS product. So I think yeah, go ahead, Debbie.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to mention, I'm going to pop back to the slide that you were just looking at here. I noticed Brian made a comment about justifying the cost with because his Excel skills are up to parties able to manage with that. And I just thought I would add to the comment, Brian, thank you for making that comment. I think in Treasury, we probably all have had some experience with Excel spreadsheets over our careers. I don't know that, we'll ever not need them in some shape or form, but I will say that one thing that does eventually help to justify the cost of moving from Excel spreadsheets to a system, especially since so many of them now are, available as software as a service, is that as your Excel spreadsheets grow, your company expands, it can become a strain on Excel and become unstable, and you can have problems with it crashing, losing data, things of that nature. So I think that is one of the things that ultimately will drive an organization to start considering the cost is as they outgrow the Excel capabilities and it becomes unstable, then they need to justify looking for a better solution. All right, we'll move on to the next slide here. This is also from the same survey that Ann was mentioning, the 2017 Technology Use Survey. On the left, we polled the audience to ask, what were some of the biggest challenges associated with your implementation, expected versus what actually happened. And on the left-hand side at the very bottom, you can see that it's noted with an asterisk in green there, that effective communication with vendors, support teams, and sticking to the implementation roadmap was the biggest challenge. We're going to talk about this more. I would say that from my experience, this is not uncommon. Communication really has to be thought out, organized, consistent. There are internal and external parties, and it is quite a task to make sure that you have an effective communication plan around a TMS implementation. And your project planning to incorporate that will make a big difference. And I'll talk a little bit later more about maybe managing your meetings and your expectations around communication plans. On the right-hand side, what we're looking at is how long did it take to implement the TMS system, expected versus reality. And the outcome of the survey was that 72% of the respondents expected to complete their implementation in 9 months or fewer. But the reality was that 52% took at least 9 months, if not longer. And so you can notice that in the one that has the large bar there, the 3 to 6 months in terms of what was expected. Only 20% achieved that. What typically was more the case is they expected 1 to 2 years, and the reality was that it took that long or more. So I would say that what the benefit we hope to deliver to you today in our conversations around project management is that one of the key success factors around a successful implementation that's both timely and effective is around your project management skills and in your communication. But it does take a long time, and we do find that corporations will consistently underestimate the amount of time and effort that it takes to actually do the implementation.
Hey, Debbie, could I just make a quick comment here? Just as a key element of the effective communication piece, I think as far as we're looking at expectation versus reality when going through an implementation like this, that one of the most important parts of the effective communication is to be able to deliver the bad news, to be able to deliver, a reality check to your management teams to say, this is really where we are, this is how much it is going to cost, and allow them to talk through what it would mean if they had to reduce scope or add resources to either bring in the timing or to maybe reduce what the initial ask was. So I just wanted to point that out as far as that communication is so important, and really to say exactly where things are is key. So thank you, Debbie.
Great, Ann. Thanks for your input there. I appreciate it. So moving on, this slide is to hopefully sort of point out what we typically see as implementation pain points. I won't go through, every aspect of what's on this particular slide, but I do want to highlight a few items. So I'll start in the top left-hand corner and work my way across to the right on the top. In the pre-planning, I would say the two biggest things that I would emphasize is sizing the project, both internally and externally. And what do we mean by sizing? There's a lot of aspects to it, but one of the areas that I often see corporate struggle with is understanding your position, honestly, in the market space. How big of an organization are you? You may be a large organization or a small one, and that makes a difference in terms of your technology needs. You may be an organization that has 50 different banks, or you might be an organization that has 2 banks, but in those 2 banks, you have, $2 billion. So scaling where you are in your relationships, both internally within the organization and externally, is important so that you can set expectations realistically. Internally, it's understanding the impact to what's already in the organization and what's going to be changing, and making sure that you've identified the areas that can you hear me? I'm sorry, I'm getting a note here that there's some sound issues. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Great, okay. So, Ann, I don't know if you're having some challenges or not, but just wanted to make sure. Let me continue. I'm sorry about that. Technology can be a little bit of a challenge, and just wanted to make sure we didn't lose sound. Moving on with the planning, the other area is identifying the internal stakeholders. If you think about that first graph I introduced about the different areas that Treasury encounters or counterparties to within an organization, think about who you have conversations with when you're trying to identify your stakeholders. And it's going to be a little bit of everyone: IT, legal, tax. Really think about the different areas you touch when you're identifying the stakeholders to bring into the project. When it comes to information gathering, process maps. I can't stress enough how beneficial doing process maps can be. They don't have to be drawn out to the most beautiful scaled level that technology is capable of drawing for us, but just going through the process of understanding your current processes, identifying where you have challenges, will help you identify what your scope needs to be. And then also it will help you identify the different stakeholders that are impacted by those same issues so that you know who to bring into the mix. Don't forget to include in your process map a technology map. Understanding all of your technology and the touch points between your different systems within your organization is critical. If you can struggle through those 2 painful processes, you're going to find that you are 10 steps ahead in making sure you get the project scoped and sized accurately. ROI, as Ann had mentioned, I won't go into a lot of detail here. Communication around ROI is imperative so that you can make sure that you have buy-in from the executive suite all the way down to the lowest, beginning entry-level position within the organization and operations, so that the organization, 1, understands the purpose, and 2, it understands, most importantly, the value of what the new systems are going to bring. Now to the bottom left, in managing the RFP and RFI, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation. I think the biggest thing corporates have a hard time is trying to understand all the vendors that are in the space, especially as new providers and new technology has come about in the last 5 to 7 years. We just continue to grow leaps and bounds, and I think taking the time to understand the inventory of the vendors that are in the space offering solutions is a challenge, and it does take a bit of time. Scope creep and change management is always a problem and a sore point with any project. I would say that it's most important that you're managing the project, that you're tracking it, and that in the very beginning you have defined what your escalation channels will be, who the decision makers will be, so that when you do hit those hurdles, you already have a plan for the process of how you're going to reach a solution. And then, as you saw in the survey, collaboration and communication is what most of our respondents in the survey indicated was the biggest challenge. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the presentation as we move forward. If we could quickly, I want to introduce a second polling question. And as Meredith brings in that second polling question, we want to know if you are undergoing an implementation, and if you've done it in the past, what was your biggest pain point? So if we could introduce that polling question.
Debbie, actually, we are experiencing some technical difficulties, so we'll come back to that polling question in just a few minutes, if that's okay.
That is fine. No, not a problem. We'll come back to that. So thank you very much for letting me know. And I believe, Ann, you have your technology solutions resolved, and I'm going to pass it back over to you to introduce the project management process.
Yes, thank you. So I think what we wanted to do here as we look into an intro to TMS project management, we'll spend a little more time on this particular slide just so that way you have an understanding of the flow and some of the critical elements of going through really any project, but then we'll highlight some of the areas that are unique for a TMS implementation. So what you're looking at here is a workflow that shows some of the key areas of activity. So you're going to start with project initiation. We'll go through planning phase. We'll build, and that includes your development configuration. Go through a validation process, which is always key for any new work that's being done, especially when you're looking at a system. And then the go live, and then a closing monitoring process. And we're gonna go through these phases in detail in just a moment. But what I'd like to do is as we're looking at starting this type of work effort, I wanted to make sure that there are a few items that we highlighted as you're getting started. So as you're looking at your resources, and I know that with in a Treasury environment, there's typically limited resources to do work, and all the budgets are tight, and you want to make sure that you can get something that will help you do your job better and faster, but with a cost in mind. So I think if you're looking at an ideal situation here and you're looking to assign a project manager to manage the work or a person to fill that role, I would just like to give you just a few ideal scenarios here. So in order of what you would want to have as far as someone leading your effort. If there's an internal project manager who has knowledge of your treasury operation, and then of course along with that your company's operations, that would be an ideal fit for someone to lead this type of an effort. If you don't have a project manager who has knowledge of your treasury operation, then I would suggest the next stop for a resource would be with your IT organization. And that way they can at least understand the internal technology and then pair that person with a very strong subject matter expert from your treasury organization to ensure that they understand the scope of what's happening and the implications of the work as you're moving through these phases. The next opportunity, and depending on the size of the project, would be assigning a subject matter expert from the Treasury Department who also has either some knowledge of doing projects or at least a willingness to learn and do that type of work. I think one of the components there is depending, again, on the size and the complexity of the project, how much time do you want your Treasury resource to be dedicated to actually running a project as opposed to having someone who is a project management professional in that role. Another key component here on this chart are the progress check points in between the different phases. So what those are really representing is it's a kind of a temperature check, see where we are with doing this work as we're looking at the plan, as we're building out the requirements and our resources. Do we have the right elements represented? Especially in the beginning of that initiation and even before you get deeper into planning. The resources and the requirement elements here are key to a strong foundation in your project. If you have the right resource or have the right resources assigned and you have the right requirements have been itemized, prioritized, and are in line with the strategy of the Treasury organization, then you're going to have success. And you can identify as many requirements are needed, and then during that planning phase, you narrow down exactly what it is that you're actually going to implement based on your timing, your cost, and any other elements of prioritization that may be taking place across the broader organization of your company. Another area here that I wanted to point out too is as you're going through these progress checks and as you're building out the work across these phases is, as we talked about earlier, the communication planning that happens here and making sure that you are including the members of your organization and that are going to have an impact here. So, we're talking about your accounting and payables and then also your tax organization, so that as you are building out those requirements, that you are including those folks in the early conversation. And then if you don't have an opportunity to have all of your resources supporting this project that are internal to your organization, anyone that you think you might need to bring in to support this from an external perspective, try to bring them on as early as possible in this process so that way they can better work on the planning elements from the beginning and have a good understanding of really what your strategy and goals are, and that'll help to define the success throughout the project. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about initiation. So we've got as you go through the initiation phase, again, this is where you get your leadership commitment, which is critical, and then Treasury is taking on project ownership. There's going to be a lot of points in this project where you're going to have maybe more focus on technology or instead of your own processes, but really the solution is for you to have a tool that will meet your needs within the next 1 to 5 years, depending on your initial implementation schedule. Creating a project charter is a great way to lay out your initial thoughts around what elements are in play here, who your stakeholders are. Again, that would be your internal or potentially external resources, assigning people to start working on this, and then drafting a scope of work for your own effort here. What does it look like? What does the size of this project look like at this point from your current understanding? And then again, requirements. I can't say enough about requirements. And if you are fortunate enough to have an organization that will provide you with a business analyst, or you have a business analyst already assigned to the Treasury organization, then I would leverage that type of an individual. I think that that is really key. Having solid requirements will really get you to the finish line in a way where you feel like you have spent money on something that is really going to help drive your business forward. And then, of course, the communication and decisioning points in the beginning. Early engagement, getting people involved as early as possible within this initiation phase is key. And then that way they can continue to support throughout the project. Planning. Planning is probably the most critical out of all these phases, because this is where you really lock down your scope. And you're going to want to make sure that you have mapped all of your requirements to either a technical design or to being supported through processes. And then as part of that locking in of your scope, you're going to go through an RFI or RFP process with your TMS vendor. And we're going to touch on that in a little more depth in just a minute, but that's a very critical component of this planning phase. Confirming your roadmap for current and future state. This can involve not only your business processes, but also your technical process. And we'll show you on the next slide an example of your Treasury technology stack. And what that will do for you is to make sure that the strategy of the Treasury organization is clearly reflected in not only where you are, but where you want to be, and that will help you drive how to get there. So that'll help to drive what types of functional and technology requirements are going to be necessary during the implementation phases. So that's why during the planning, you really need to spend a lot of time around understanding those elements. We talked already about the importance of resourcing, and during this phase also is when you're gonna lock in your costs. If there's an ROI that needs to be put together, then that is a point where you would start to build that out, and then also assessing any of your financial and strategic benefits that are going to come from working on this TMS implementation. And as for the RFI, RFP process, Debbie, can you take us through some of your experience with that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think that one thing you have to think about in the planning stage around the RFI or the RFP process is, how your organization is structured, how formal the process is or is not within your organization, will determine whether it needs to be a project to itself or if it can run within this one. But I think it's very common that the RFP process takes longer than is anticipated sometimes. If you have a very formal process within your organization, then you want to really assess that during this planning phase, how long that needs to take. And one thing that you might do before an RFP is to do an RFI to try and narrow the scope of the field. So a request for information is a shorter, easier way to go out and solicit some information without all the quotes and the specific details, to try and narrow down your list of potential vendors. And then from that, and often within organizations that have very structured processes with their procurement departments around RFPs, sometimes you can do the RFI a little more efficiently and quickly without so much of the influence from other areas, and then you have a smaller pooling list to have to send out for the RFP. And then when you get the RFP, instead of having 5 different vendors that's quoting a rather large bid, you're maybe only have 2 to 3 that are actually going through the full RFP process. So that can be a really big benefit to think through that during this planning phase and to have that conversation within your organization about which one is the right one for you, how much time is it really going to take, and are the same parties that are involved in the RFP, are those the same stakeholders that need to be involved in the long-term TMS implementation, or are they a subset that then rolls out of the process once the selection is made? So I think really taking time to have those discussions within your organization during the planning phase will make sure that you adequately plan for the resources that you're going to need and the time that it's going to take.
Thank you, Debbie. So in the prior slide, I mentioned the looking at your current and future state map, and I think we even had a question around reporting and or comment about the significance of it. And you can see here, when you're looking at your scope considerations within the planning phase, here's an example of a Treasury technology stack where you want to look at what your solutions are going to be for analytics, for reporting, your systems and business processes, and connectivity, internal and external. So, who are you connecting to? Even besides, you've got banks, you've got data aggregators, you've got trading platforms and settlement systems, and then, of course, your data and your data architecture. Looking at, what do you need to do with the data? Does that need to be mapped and transformed within the process? How is it being loaded? What's the storage components here? So all of these elements really need to be considered as a part of your planning, so that way you have everything identified very clearly that needs to be addressed during the project. And if you're not going to address it, maybe there's some alternative approach that you're going to take until such time that you might want to spend to implement something in addition to what you're going to go with for your first phase of the project, right? Your total scope might not be available to you for implementation right now, so you're going to pick and choose what's most important in this planning phase. And then to finalize your planning activities, you'll go through your locking down your plan, your implementation plan, your communication plans, and risk plans. So making sure that you have identified ahead of time some areas for where you have to track some risk. That's very important. And then also you're going to want to spend time identifying what your static data needs are and then the pre-work around that. And then also finalizing the training approach that you're going to take as part of the next phases of the project. And I think from this final slide around planning, I think we'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about static data. So Debbie, could you just kind of touch on some of the key elements around the static data and pre-work that we would need to do on this type of implementation?
Sure, I'd be happy to. One comment I'd like to make before I move on to the static data is around the communication and tracking. To your point, just to expand on that a little bit, I would say that one of the things that is key is successful communication and tracking is to have regularly scheduled, productive meetings. So that doesn't mean just have a meeting, touch bases, and everyone visits for 30 minutes or an hour. If you run a very structured, organized meeting to go through your project plan, to identify any gaps, to address timeline issues, resource issues, things of that nature, effective meetings are really critical to that communication plan, because this is where everyone is coming to gather information. The information that they acquire in that short bit of time that you're going to have with them is the information that's going to then be disseminated throughout your organization. So I think one of the most critical things in your communication plan is to have well-structured and organized meetings on a regular, reoccurring basis with your team members. And then moving on to static data, I think what I like to point out there is static data is sort of the a beginning phase of when you are implementing the TMS. And I think that one of the mistakes about static data is that it doesn't really get thought very cohesively or very thoroughly until you get into the implementation phase. And static data really needs to be moved into the planning. Do it early. You need to be thinking about what is the quality of your data, what is the quality of the systems you currently have. I hate to use the phrase garbage in, garbage out, but you don't want to carry into a brand new system that you're spending all this money to implement bad data that is poor to begin with. If some want to clean and then and start with completely clean data. Some want to dump the data in and then clean it as you go. I think you really need to, early on in the planning stages, assess what is the quality of your information and determine which is going to be the best strategy for you, because if you have a lot of cleanup work to do, you really need to plan for how that cleanup is going to happen. If you choose to put data in the system and then clean up to some degree, the problem you're going to have is a resource challenge in that now they're trying to implement, they're trying to do the work of the implementation at the same time that they're trying to clean up. So I find that a lot of times timelines can be really hindered because we as corporates just haven't given enough attention to the detail of maintaining our records and understanding how much cleanup does or does not need to be done early enough in the project, and then it sort of snowballs on you after you're in the implementation phase, and that's what you want to make sure you're avoiding. So think about how well your accounts are reconciled. Is your chart of accounts cleaned up? How many do you have? Are you going to be, reducing those and trying to reduce them down? At what point is that going to happen? Those are the types of questions you want to be asking yourself during this planning phase, not later after you've made the selection of the provider and now you're trying to gather all the data, because at that point you could run into a lot of problems you weren't aware of that can really impact your implementation timeline.
Thanks, Debbie. So now that we're moving out of planning and into building, just some highlights here really is your build is going to be any development and configuration that's going to be done. And with a TMS within that environment, it's usually going to be loading your static data, going through access and security, and then configuring that environment to then potentially work as an isolated system, or if in an optimal situation is that you're now enabling this to, you're feeding data across, banks, your accounting platforms, your internal reporting systems, and any connectivity and file aggregation activities are happening. So this is a time when there's a lot of work spent on implementing the technology stack that we just looked at, and then also going through unit testing. And then also during this build phase is when you're going to make sure that you have fully developed your business test cases for UAT and regression. You've got all your scripts aligned, and those are all in line with your requirements. So again, you're using those requirements from your initial planning phase, and you're ensuring that those requirements are met through those test case and test scripts. And again, you're going to include potentially not just Treasury, but accounting, banking partners, payable, and tax throughout this process. And then validating. This is really key. You want to make sure that you have validated all of those requirements. Again, I can't say enough about it. Having a traceability matrix to ensure that everything that the system was expected to deliver and that the connected systems are expected to deliver, that all that data is flowing properly and that all of your transactions are working in accordance with what was initially designed. And then to do that, you've got your UAT and your regression testing. During this process, Debbie, do you want to maybe touch a little bit on some of your experience with UAT and how you've gone through that?
I'm just going to make one quick comment for time's sake. Make sure when you're thinking about your testing early on, identify what test cases you're going to use, how you want to document them, how are you going to document mitigation, changes, retesting, and think about audit, because somewhere along the way the system is going to be audited either by your internal or external auditors, and your test plans, your documentation around your testing are going to be the things that you can easily hand over to them and let them review to get buy-in on the system, and will save you a lot of headaches in the end.
Thanks, Debbie. And then one of the final activities during this validation stage is to build out your cutover and your backout plan. So don't forget that this is where you might also decide that you want to run in parallel on either with your current process versus the new system. That's also an option too. You can discuss those opportunities with your vendor. And then we have go live, executing your cutover plan, and then going into a period of warranty production support. And depending on the complexity of your implementation, that could be anywhere between 30 and 60 days. And then transitioning to production support. During that time, you're going to have your project team at the ready, and then your production team will also be getting involved. And then obviously, going back to clear communication, you're going to be communicating across the Treasury, accounting, IT, any external vendors that are involved to make sure that everything is running smoothly. And then the monitor and support. Debbie, do you want to run through some of these elements?
Yeah, I have one quick question, and I'm going to pop back to your other slide here for just a second.
Yep.
Would you give me a little bit, maybe an example, under the warranty and product support phase there of Go Live, what are you expecting out of your vendor at that in that period?
So for the warranty and product support phase, that's really when, like I said, could be 30, could be 60 days when the project team is still engaged to support the activity. Like, so if anything goes wrong, if there are any errors in the system, any issues with data coming in and out, or transactions executing appropriately within the environment, that's where you've got your project team is still working on it. They're still on the hook. They have not been transitioned off of the project until a formal closeout of the project. And that would be in that next phase. So this way you know that the people who worked on implementing are available to help resolve the issues as quickly as possible.
Right.
And that would be, and that's instead of going through a production support which you need to put a ticket in, and then there's a separate different process for that.
Okay, great. So if you're doing a rolling or a fix, you may, if you're doing a rolling go live, for example, you may be in the warranty phase working with the implementation team for some parts of the project and already in customer support for parts that have already been completed. Or if you're doing all at once, then you're with one team or the other. It just depends on how you choose to cut over.
Right, and that would have to be an agreed upon approach during that planning phase of the project.
Okay, great, thank you, appreciate that. This is lessons learned, monitor, and support. So, what you want to do when you're done with a go live is, shortly after go live, before you go over to the support team, take time to sit back and look at the lessons learned. Make sure you understand who the owners are going to be for the live system. That may shift from who is implementing, not just from the vendor side, but also from who's supporting it internally. Don't forget to recognize and reward your implementation teams. These projects do, as we saw in the survey, take several months to a year or more to implement, and they're usually doing their full-time job on top of doing this. So don't forget to think about the rewards and recognition. Do have a formal close process for the project to officially close the project, to let everyone know that the implementation phase has ended, you're in production, and communicate who all of the different parties will be for supporting the live implemented solution. And the next part is optimize, what you need to do to optimize your system. We recommend that 6 to 12 months after you've closed the project, bring some of those key team members back that are actually using the system from the different functional areas that help to implement, and make sure that you take a look at, here's what we were expecting to implement, this is what is being used, and identify if you have any gaps. You don't want to end up being that survey respondent that said they are only using 20% of, or 30% of what they actually purchased. If you find those gaps, you need to identify them and address, how you're going to mitigate those gaps. Also take the opportunity to review any patches from the vendor that's coming through, review your IT's calendar, review the vendor's upgrade calendars. Make sure everyone is aware, after go live, of upcoming changes and upgrades and patches, so that you don't lose data, you don't have interruptions of functionality, things of that nature. And then annually, you want to do an assessment. Again, bring those same functional members back again, review any new enhancements that the vendors introduced, identify if there's some functionality that you want to add to your TMS, and how you want to go about doing that. Does it need to be another project? Is it simply an easy add-on? What needs to be done to add that additional functionality? And make sure that on an annual basis you're doing your due diligence. Audit the systems, manage your controls, update all of your policies and procedures, not only in the formal documentation that you do within the organization, but within the system itself. And make sure that you're keeping your bank account management information updated within the system as well. That becomes more and more critical as more information is needed around making payments, and keeping that bank data up to date is going to be critical, as all of you know that are involved in processing payments now. You can't just, like the old days, put in account number and the Fed reference number and go. You have to have, the full address of the bank and the address of the beneficiary, things of that nature. So maintaining all that data is critical, and the only way, honestly, it gets done is if you stop once a year and take a look at and assess those needs and make sure that they're being done. Final takeaways, I'm not going to go through all of these, but plan early and then execute. You are the steward over the organization, so it is Treasury's role to bring all these parties together, introduce the project, help scope it, and make sure that all the different areas understand the value that it's going to bring to their part of the organization. try and think from their chair and address their needs, and then you'll get buy-in a lot quicker. Don't rush the RFP process. Understand what your needs are, how your organization works, and adequately plan for that and your timeline. And then don't underestimate how long it will be to take to implement. Be realistic about that, and do your homework around your scoping and your technology stack to make sure you are getting the system that you need and not buying more than you really functionally need. And I'll turn it back over to you to go through the remainder of the takeaways and to close this out and take us into Q&A.
Okay. So just a few highlights here. When do you need a project management expert? I think, this came up a little bit, based on the size of the work, the complexity of the work. That's when you really need to get someone who not only has experience in project management, but ideally in doing TMS implementations. Being flexible yet structured, so stick to the requirements and the delivery model, but make sure that you understand that things can change along the way. Having good data, collaboration with your vendors and your key stakeholders, and then regular check-ins and review during the phases of your project should keep you honest and keep you on track. And then I think from there, we had a case study that can be reviewed at a later time. We won't go through that, but do we have any additional questions that we would want to answer before we end the call? I think, do we want to do the polling question?
Yeah, let's throw that last polling question in, and if anybody wants to type in a question before we wrap up. But if you don't mind the polling question, how many of you planning to do an implementation? What were your biggest pain points? If there's any questions that you come up with after we close this out, we'll monitor as it closes out, and we'll make sure we address your questions after the call. Great. So we have a lot of non-users or implementers so far, but I hope that this information has been useful to you today. We'd love to hear your feedback, and looks like configuration and development is running neck and neck with testing and validation as a pain point. I did have one comment mentioning the reporting, and I agree with that. Individual reporting can be quite a challenge, so it is important to go through and identify all of your reports in advance and understand how much customization you may be requiring. That can be an added expense if you don't address that up front.
Thanks, everybody. We really appreciate your time today. Meredith, do you want to finish the webinar for us?
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. I do want to encourage you to take our Treasury Fraud and Controls survey. We do hope that you found this presentation insightful and informative. We'll stay online for a few more minutes for any last-minute questions. Do continue to check our website often, as we host many webinars throughout the year. And a final reminder that we will send out the presentation, a recording, and the CTP credit form within the next 7 business days. Thank you so much.